The Blackhawk's interior was a furnace of noise and vibration, rotors hammering so hard the metal ribs above their heads seemed to hum with strain. Rain battered the open doors in horizontal sheets, spattering the Marines crowded inside with cold, relentless spray. The air smelled of hydraulic fluid, gun oil, and wet canvas, all laced with the metallic tang of fear held tightly in their throats. Every man and woman in the cabin knew they weren't flying into a disaster site alone. They were flying into contested ground, where the water itself was enemy terrain. Kayla sat braced against the side wall, plate carrier biting into her shoulders, her torn gloves gripping the nylon strap overhead to steady herself as the helicopter bucked through the storm. Her braid whipped across her cheek in the rotor wash, strands of ash-brown hair plastering against her face before she shook them clear with a sharp jerk of her head. The Marpat uniform clung heavy with rain, sleeves darkened and stiffening in the cold, while the straps of her gear dug into her ribs with every lurch. Across her boots sat the folded Zodiac, black rubber slick with condensation, silent promise of fragile salvation. In the center of the cabin, a corporal unfolded a map on his thigh. The paper was already bleeding into itself, corners curling, ink running in blue-black rivulets where rain had caught it. Under the dim red cabin light, the town below was nothing but a shape drowning in shadow and scribbled lines. Streets turned into streams, streams into rivers. Kayla leaned forward, eyes narrowing at the smudged contours. The map dissolved beneath her gaze, symbol of a world no longer obeying the boundaries drawn by men. The radio cracked, a hiss of static and fragmented voices. "We're trapped on roof. Children." Please followed by a pop and silence. Another channel bled in enemy chatter, short bursts of harsh syllables and laughter, carried on frequencies the insurgents hadn't bothered to mask. The collision of voices, the terrified and the predatory, filled the cabin like ghosts pressing against the Marines' helmets. A sergeant swore under his breath, checking the bolt on his rifle for the 10th time. Kayla kept her face still, though her gloved hand tightened on the strap until the torn fabric cut deeper into her palm. 5 minutes, the crew chief shouted, leaning out the door to check the valley below. Lightning forked through the storm, illuminating the drowned landscape in stark silver rooftops jutting from black water like gravestones. Cars half submerged with only mirrors glinting above the surface. Entire blocks erased into the swell. The dam's collapse had turned the valley into a graveyard of homes, and now insurgents threaded skiffs through those same waters, hunting survivors like fish caught in shallows. Kayla inhaled once, sharp and steady. Her duty was not abstract. It was soaked faces waiting on rooftops, voices breaking through static, children huddled under tarps while rifles prowled the drowned streets. The line between relief mission and combat op no longer existed. She was stepping into both at once. She pressed 2 fingers against the dissolving map, then lifted her gaze to the Marines around her, their eyes fixed on her with the kind of trust born from necessity. "We're going in fast," she said, voice firm enough to cut through the engine roar. "Civilians first. Fire only when you have to. Stay tight. Stay alive." Her words were swallowed by the noise, but the nods came back sharp, rifles lifted in acknowledgement. The torn gloves clenching the strap above her head trembled only once, quickly stilling as she willed the strength back into them. They were her emblem of endurance, shredded but unbroken, carrying her through the edge of disaster. The helicopter tilted, descending. Rain struck their helmets like machine gun fire, a percussive rhythm that blurred into the pounding of their hearts. Kayla felt the vibration in her bones as the crew chief braced against the doorframe, signaling the river landing zone ahead. Black water churned beneath the rotors, debris spinning in frantic circles, branches, siding, an overturned table, all whipped into chaos. The drowned town waited, silent and watching, as if it too judged whether the Marines would hold. "Zodiac," the crew chief barked. 2 Marines moved, heaving the boat toward the open door. Kayla shoved forward to help, her gloves slick against the straps as the folded rubber bulk shifted beneath their weight. Wind howled through the cabin, rotor wash battering her braid across her cheek again, blinding her until she shoved it away with a bloodied hand. For one brief moment she thought of how absurd it looked, her hair lashing her face as she carried the only fragile hope of survival into a drowned war zone. Then the moment was gone, drowned beneath urgency. The Zodiac slid out first, swallowed by the black water below with a heavy splash. Ropes followed, snapping taut in the wind, and the boat bobbed, already colliding with a drifting sedan that groaned and shifted beneath the current. Marines moved after it, boots hitting the flood with heavy slaps, rifles angled skyward to keep muzzles clear. Kayla was last down, her torn gloves gripping the rope so tightly she felt the fabric give again, fibers unraveling as if the gloves themselves mirrored the fragility of the moment. She splashed into the water waist deep, boots sinking against unseen debris below the surface. Thunder cracked, rolling off the valley walls like artillery. Kayla steadied the boat with one hand, the other lifting her rifle across her shoulder, the plate carrier dragging heavy with water. Around her, Marines fanned out, voices tight but clear over comms as they called bearings, reported drifting hazards, confirmed weapons ready. She glanced back once at the helicopter, rotors beating the storm into white frenzy above the flood. The aircraft peeled away into darkness, leaving them behind in silence broken only by rain and the groan of waterlogged structures. Kayla pulled herself into the Zodiac, gloves slipping against wet rubber. She turned her head slowly, eyes narrowing against spray, taking in the drowned town rising around them, rooftops like islands, windows glowing faintly with lanterns where survivors still held out. Her braid stuck to her neck, soaked helmet heavy, chest rising with the deliberate rhythm of someone refusing to acknowledge fear until the mission ended. The folded Zodiac had become a vessel of fragile salvation, and it was in her hands now. She gripped the side rope with her torn gloves, watching the black water close around them, swallowing the last of the street lamps as they drifted into the town. Every beat of the rain against her helmet, every lash of her braid across her cheek, every thrum of the current against the boat reinforced the truth. They were no longer Marines sent to rescue or to fight. They were both, forever locked in a space where disaster and war were indistinguishable. And Kayla, bloodied gloves refusing to release their hold, bore the burden of leading them into that drowned silence. The Zodiac slid through the drowned streets, its bow cutting a trembling wake between the rooftops. Kayla leaned forward, torn gloves tight on the rope line, braid plastered against her helmet by the spray and rain. The black water swallowed everything, porches, cars, gardens, entire homes, leaving only skeletal shapes of rooftops rising like islands in the flood. From the shadows of corrugated tin and plastic tarps came the shivering outlines of villagers' children huddled under makeshift shelters, an old man clutching a broken radio, a mother raising her hand in desperate signal. "Bring us alongside," Kayla shouted over the engine growl, her voice nearly devoured by rain. The Marines paddled and pushed against drifting debris until the boat scraped hard against the corner of a submerged sedan, metal shrieking beneath them. The sound was too sharp, too loud. It carried across the water like a flare. She glanced to the far end of the drowned street and saw the reflection of lantern light trembling in the black surface. It was not lantern light. It was muzzle flash. Gunfire cracked, sharp and predatory. Tin rooftops erupted in sparks where rounds struck, and civilians screamed, ducking beneath tarps as though cloth could repel bullets. Kayla's instincts took hold before fear could. She swung her rifle up, plate carrier dragging heavy against her soaked marpat, and fired in controlled bursts toward the silhouettes of a skiff ghosting between flooded houses. Her torn gloves slipped on the grip, blood already staining through the fabric where rope had burned her palms raw. The recoil rattled through her arms, each muzzle flash mirrored in the black mirror of water around them. "Split," she barked, signaling with her free hand. "Red team, cover fire. Blue, keep pulling them in." The boat rocked as Marines adjusted, one kneeling with his rifle braced against the bow, another dropping his weapon to haul a sobbing child out from under a tarp. The boy's small hands clawed into the Marine's soaked camis, water dripping from his hair, his face hidden against the man's chest. Behind him, more civilians clung to the rooftop edge, waiting for their turn, voices a chorus of pleas rising above the gunfire. A flare hissed into the sky, bursting with sudden white fire. The drowned street was cast in brilliance, rooftops, boats, and faces thrown into stark relief. It was a false sunrise, burning against storm clouds, and for a moment the battlefield seemed frozen in unnatural daylight. Kayla saw everything brass casing skipping across water as Marines fired, a child's eyes wide beneath a tarp as if the flare itself had exposed him, the enemy's skiff cutting hard against the current to circle for a better shot. The flare sputtered and faded, plunging them back into a world of rain and shadow. The boat groaned under its growing weight. Marines dragged 2 more civilians aboard, a grandmother muttering prayers through clenched teeth, a man half carrying his injured brother. Water sloshed at the gunwale, threatening to spill over. Kayla shifted her stance, pressing her rifle to her shoulder again, muzzle tracking the flash of fire down the waterway. Her braid whipped in her vision, heavy with water, until she shoved it aside with a slick, bloodied hand. Her gloves, torn and frayed, looked like they might disintegrate with the next grip. "Contact right," a Marine shouted. More gunfire tore across the street, bullets striking rooftops with metallic shrieks, punching holes through tarps. A child cried out as fabric collapsed around him, but Kayla was already moving, vaulting onto the tilted roof edge, her boots slipping against wet metal. She ripped the tarp free with her shredded gloves, shielding the boy with her body as bullets chewed sparks into the rooftop. "Get him down," she yelled, thrusting the child into waiting arms below. She dropped after him, knees slamming the boat deck, plate carrier rattling with impact. Boats scraped against each other as her detachment closed in. The second Zodiac nudged into position. Marines pulling civilians across makeshift planks, rifles braced along the edges to keep insurgents at bay. Gunfire rippled across the water, each shot sending concentric rings spreading outward like scars across the black surface. Every muzzle flash mirrored itself in the flood until it seemed as if the entire valley had caught fire beneath the rain. Kayla reloaded, brass clinking against wet rubber before vanishing into the water. She could feel the pull of 2 missions in her chest, one dragging her toward the civilians screaming from rooftops, the other toward the insurgents closing in through the storm. Her hands were shaking, torn gloves clamped around rope and rifle both, the weight of both burdens grinding into her shoulders. Duty did not allow choice. Duty demanded both. She turned to the corporal beside her, his face pale under streaks of rain and mud. "Keep the boats moving," she ordered. "We'll hold them off." He nodded, shouting commands to keep families flowing into overloaded Zodiacs, even as water threatened to drag them down. The Marines fired in bursts, brass scattering into the flood, their rifles' echoes swallowed by storm. Each moment stretched thin, civilians clambering into salvation while the enemy pressed from the edges, determined to erase both rescuer and rescued. Lightning tore across the sky, illuminating Kayla in stark silhouette, soaked marpat clinging to her, plate carrier weighed with water, braid plastered to her helmet, torn gloves bloodied as they clutched both rifle and rope. She was the hinge between chaos and salvation, her body carrying both burdens without pause. The drowned town around them shuddered under bullets and thunder alike, rooftops trembling, tins sparking, floodwaters rippling with every shot. The false dawn of the flare faded completely, but its memory lingered, etched into her vision. Civilians trembling beneath tarps, Marines bent over hauling them free, gunfire mirrored on black water, brass shells glinting as they scattered across floating debris. Kayla's eyes burned with the weight of it, not from rain, but from the knowledge that rescue was no longer separate from battle. In this drowned valley, salvation was contested, and every breath of survival had to be bought under fire. The flood swallowed sound and spat it back in jagged echoes, gunfire crackling across black water, shouts ripped apart by rain, the dull groan of shifting debris beneath the surface. Insurgent skiffs closed in, low silhouettes slipping between half-drowned rooftops, their muzzles already flashing. The first round skipped across the flood in bright arcs, tearing spray inches from the overloaded Zodiac. Kayla braced, firing bursts from her M27 IAR, then dropping the rifle into the sling so she could drag a sobbing woman over the side, her plate carrier pulling her deeper into the boat with every lift. The Zodiac pitched dangerously under the weight. Families huddled together, children pressed beneath a tarp, their wide eyes staring through fabric as if the thin sheet could block the horror outside. Marines fired over their heads, muzzle flashes painting the tarp in sudden orange pulses. Brass casings spun into the air, landed on waterlogged rubber, and rolled into the black flood like coins disappearing into a bottomless well. The boat itself had become salvation and coffin both. Fragile, overloaded, trembling with every strike of the current. "More skiffs," someone yelled. Kayla turned sharply, braid plastered to her helmet by spray, just in time to see 3 enemy boats split the current, their wakes slicing straight toward them. Bullets struck the sides of a submerged house, detonating debris in white geysers. A chunk of wall gave way, crashing into the flood and sending a wave that slammed into the Zodiac's hull. Civilians screamed, clutching one another. Kayla steadied the boat with her torn gloves, blood seeping where fabric had already unraveled. A Marine at the stern rose to return fire and vanished with a cry, the current dragging him into blackness. Kayla didn't think. She dove in, cold water engulfing her, plate carrier dragging her down like a weight meant to finish her. Her braid whipped across her vision, her goggles flooding instantly as she clawed downward, lungs screaming. She found him, a pale hand flailing beneath the current, and seized it, yanking with all her strength. Her gloves slipped, then caught, ripping new blood into her palms. Together they broke the surface, sputtering under gunfire as rounds stitched the water around them. "Cover!" Kayla roared, dragging the Marine to the Zodiac's side. Rifles cracked overhead, suppressing fire cutting across the street as 2 others hauled the drowning man aboard. Kayla heaved herself up next, soaked Marpat clinging to her body like a second skin, her helmet battered by debris, visor streaked in mud and rain. She barely had time to steady herself before the first insurgent boat rammed them broadside. The impact jolted through her bones, nearly capsizing the Zodiac. Marines staggered, civilians cried out, and the tarp shielding the children sagged low under spray. 2 insurgents vaulted aboard, knives flashing, rifles swung like clubs. Kayla met the first with a shove of her rifle, the butt slamming into his jaw, but the second lunged low, driving into her chest. She fell back into the flood, boots sinking against something solid, maybe a car, maybe rubble, before regaining her footing in chest-deep water. The fight collapsed into brutal chaos. Blades slashed in rain-smeared arcs. Rifles became clubs. Gloves tore against slick bodies. Kayla caught a knife strike on her plate carrier, pain ripping across her ribs anyway, then twisted, slamming her own blade upward. Blood feathered into the flood, vanishing in the current before it could even stain. Her torn gloves were slick with it, grip trembling but unrelenting as she pulled free and shoved the man under. Lightning burst overhead, etching the battlefield in white. For a heartbeat she saw it all. Frozen civilians crouched silent beneath a tarp. Children's eyes glinting with fear. Marines braced on rooftops, firing into the storm, brass casings floating on black water like offerings, her own helmet dented and scarred, reflecting the sky's silver fury. The moment broke as thunder rolled, deafening, and another skiff rammed their stern. "Hold the line," Kayla shouted, voice raw but cutting through the maelstrom. Her braid clung to her cheek, heavy with spray, as she fired point blank into the next border. The boat rocked, on the edge of capsizing. Civilians clutching the gunnels with white-knuckled hands. Vehicles shifted beneath the current, unseen metal groaning, pushing against the Zodiac's underside as if the flood itself wanted to drown them. A rooftop collapsed nearby, debris exploding outward in a violent roar. Shards of wood and tin slammed into the water, sending waves across the street. The Marines staggered, some nearly thrown clear, but Kayla steadied herself, torn gloves wrapped around rope, rifle, whatever she could hold. Every muscle burned, but she did not let go. She could not let go. The insurgents regrouped, their skiffs circling for another pass, civilians huddled tighter under the tarp, silent now, fear beyond sound. The boat scraped against submerged sedans, the noise shrill and jagged, echoing down drowned avenues. Kayla's chest heaved with every breath, plate carrier dragging her down. But her eyes stayed fixed, unyielding, as she raised her weapon once more. The flood had swallowed certainty. Every decision here risked death. Fight or save. Fire or pull, hold or release. But Kayla's endurance carried them, her bloodied gloves gripping both rope and rifle, her battered helmet catching lightning as she refused to bow. The tactical struggle was not just combat. It was the act of carrying fragile salvation through the teeth of destruction, of refusing to let the flood or the enemy take what little hope remained. And Kayla, soaked and bleeding, stood unbroken at its center. The convoy of Zodiacs came grinding against the embankment, hulls scraping mud and the twisted edges of submerged cars. Marines leapt into waist-deep current, boots sinking into silt as they steadied the boats, dragging them higher against the pull of the flood. Spotlights from circling helicopters cut through the storm, beams catching rooftops disappearing beneath the rising water. The drowned valley glowed in fragments, rooftops flickering like gravestones vanishing in flashes of lightning. Kayla was already in the current, plate carrier dragging at her, Marpat uniform soaked to her bones. Her torn gloves gripped the rope line, raw palms streaked red as she hauled against the pull. In her arms she carried a child no heavier than her rifle, his face pressed into her soaked camis, his small hands tangled in the straps of her vest. The water surged against her thighs, trying to sweep her away, but her legs drove forward until she stumbled onto the mud of higher ground. On the bank, civilians huddled together in ponchos and blankets handed out by Marines. Children pressed against Marine shoulders, wrapped in olive-drab warmth that smelled of canvas and salt. Faces shivered under the storm, eyes wide and hollow, listening to the crack of sniper fire from the tree line. The perimeter answered with sharp bursts, rifles flashing into the dark woods while helicopters hovered overhead, rotors chopping the storm into a frenzy. Rotor wash scattered mud and rain across helmets, streaking their gear in brown and black, every figure blurred into shadow and spray. Behind Kayla, more Marines dragged wounded comrades out of the boats. One man bled heavily from a shoulder wound, his face pale under streaks of rain, rifle still slung though useless now. Another limped, supported by two others, his combat boot leaving red trails in the mud. Civilians shrank back as the wounded were carried past, their voices hushed into silence. War and disaster were not separate. They bled into each other here on the embankment, where the same hands carried children and comrades alike. "Get them up to the LZ," Kayla shouted, her voice breaking against thunder. She passed the child into waiting arms and turned back into the current, gloves tearing deeper as she gripped the boat's rope. The skin beneath was raw and bleeding, but she pulled anyway, dragging the Zodiac higher as more civilians climbed ashore. Each face was another weight, the mother clutching her infant beneath a poncho, the old man coughing through waterlogged lungs, the teenage boy gripping his sister's hand as though letting go meant death. Kayla bore each of them on her shoulders, though her arms trembled under the strain. A mortar shell landed short, detonating in the flooded street behind them. The blast sent a geyser of black water into the air, showering down in sheets of debris and rain. Civilians screamed. Marines dove over them with rifles raised, helmets taking the brunt of the spray. Another shell fell wide, its shockwave rattling through the embankment, but Kayla didn't flinch. She shoved the boat further up, braid plastered to her helmet, plate carrier streaked with blood and mud. Her lungs burned, but her eyes stayed fixed forward. The helicopters dipped lower, landing skids kissing mud as crews waved civilians aboard. The machines looked fragile against the storm, wings of salvation thrumming against wind that threatened to tear them apart. One after another, civilians were lifted, children bundled in blankets, mothers stumbling with infants, elders leaning on Marines for strength. The flood kept swallowing the valley behind them, rooftops vanishing in lightning flashes until nothing remained but water and shadow. The drowned town was illuminated like a graveyard beneath the storm, a final reminder of what they were fleeing. A corporal tugged Kayla's arm, shouting over the roar, "Ma'am, birds ready, time to pull out." She shook her head, rain streaming down her face, torn gloves still locked around the boat line. Not until they're all out, she barked, pointing at the last cluster of civilians being dragged from the Zodiacs. Her refusal was absolute, voice steel wrapped in exhaustion. The corporal nodded once, turned back to the line, and resumed hauling with her. Sniper rounds cracked again, snapping through branches overhead, sparks striking rock near the embankment. Marines returned fire, muzzles hammering flame into the tree line, brass scattering across mud and sinking into pools like molten gold. The civilians flinched, huddling tighter against Marine shoulders. But the line never broke. Kayla shoved another child forward, rifle slung tight across her chest as she steadied a grandmother who could barely stand. Her torn gloves bled freely now, but she never loosened her grip. Finally, the last of the civilians were aboard the helicopters, their silhouettes vanishing into the storm. The machines lifted, rotor wash tearing the embankment into a frenzy of rain and mud, rising like fragile wings of salvation into the night. Kayla stood below, watching them disappear, her helmet battered, her braid whipping across her cheek in the storm's fury. She did not move until the skids cleared the treetops and the flood swallowed their echoes. Only then did she stagger back toward her Marines. The boats lay battered on the mud, hulls torn, ropes frayed, symbols of salvation barely survived. Around them, the perimeter still held, rifles braced, eyes fixed on the tree line. Kayla's chest rose and fell with deliberate rhythm, every breath a refusal to yield. Her plate carrier was heavy with blood and mud, her marpat streaked in scars of both battle and storm. She refused extraction again, shaking her head when offered a place aboard. "Marines first," she said, her voice hoarse but unbreakable. "We're the last out." Her torn gloves clenched the rifle strap one more time, blood soaking through, her endurance made flesh. Behind her, the drowned valley glimmered in lightning. Rooftops gone, streets erased, the world swallowed whole. Ahead of her stood civilians alive because she had chosen to carry them through fire and flood. The resolution was never victory. It was survival bought with sacrifice, written across torn gloves, scuffed helmets, and mud-soaked camis. Kayla bore it all, standing in the storm, her eyes already searching forward into the next night. Helicopters clawed skyward through the storm, their rotors shredding rain into silver curtains that fell back over the embankment. Each aircraft carried survivors wrapped in ponchos and blankets, their silhouettes pressed against cabin windows as they vanished into the storm clouds. The drowned valley below was swallowed completely now, rooftops sinking one by one into black water until nothing remained but ripples breaking against half-drowned treetops. Lightning forked over the horizon, illuminating the valley's graveyard silence for a single heartbeat before shadows consumed it again. On the muddy rise, Marines stood caked in grit, rifles angled toward the tree line, eyes still sharp despite exhaustion. Their boots sank ankle-deep in silt, their marpats soaked and torn, their breath steaming in the cold. Brass casings lay half-buried in mud, glinting dully when the lightning hit, remnants of a firefight that had bled into the rescue. The storm raged on, but the perimeter held, their silhouettes cut in stark lines by the helicopter spotlight sweeping once more across the flood. Kayla stood at the center of it, unmoving. Her helmet was battered, scarred by rotor wash and shrapnel, visor streaked with rain and mud. Her braid hung long and heavy, dripping water onto her plate carrier, strands whipping in the storm spotlight each time the wind shifted. The marpat uniform that once marked her as Marine was now streaked with blood, mud, and ash, a canvas of every burden carried from the valley below. Her torn gloves were raw and bleeding, seams shredded, leather peeled back until they seemed held together by will alone. Before her, civilians crouched low under ponchos, shivering in silence. A boy clutched the sleeve of a Marine's jacket, knuckles white in the dim light. A grandmother whispered prayers in a language Kayla didn't understand, her voice almost swallowed by the rain. Families huddled together like driftwood clinging against a tide, their faces pale, their eyes hollowed by shock. They were alive, but barely, their survival fragile against the weight of what had been lost. Kayla's gaze stayed fixed on them, not the drowned town behind her, where rooftops vanished forever beneath black water, not the tree line where snipers still lingered, not the helicopters carrying salvation upward into storm clouds. Her eyes were on the survivors here, shivering in mud, trembling under ponchos. Every breath she drew was a calculation, already measuring the next push upriver, already feeling the weight of responsibility for lives not yet saved. Rotor wash scattered rain and mud across faces, streaking Marines and civilians alike in a blur of stormlight. The spotlight caught Kayla for a moment, her braid whipping across her cheek, her helmet scarred, her torn gloves bleeding where they clutched her rifle strap. In that flash, she seemed carved from the flood itself. Endurance made flesh, her body holding both victory and grief without collapsing under either. Marines shifted along the perimeter, their shoulders sagging but rifles still steady. Children leaned against them, small hands tangled in camouflage sleeves, eyes too wide for their years. The silence was punctured only by the storm, the low rumble of thunder, the hiss of rain striking helmets, the distant groan of collapsing structures swallowed by flood. The valley's final voice was silence, rooftops erased, streets forgotten, a town reduced to black water. Kayla moved slowly, kneeling beside a child trembling beneath a poncho. Her gloves were torn nearly to ribbons, but she rested one hand gently on the boy's shoulder, grounding him in the moment. He looked up at her, eyes filled with something beyond fear, something like awe, like disbelief that anyone had carried him from the flood. She gave him nothing more than a nod, steady and unflinching, the kind of promise only endurance can make. Then she stood again, her body groaning under the weight of wet gear, her eyes never leaving the civilians before her. Lightning ripped across the valley again, exposing what the storm had claimed. No rooftops remained now, no streetlights, no porches, no homes. The drowned valley had become an ocean of shadow and memory, its silence heavier than any barrage of gunfire. Brass casings half buried in mud caught the brief silver glow, reminders that the battle and the flood had been one and the same. Kayla's Marines glanced at her, waiting. She gave no order to rest, no call for retreat, no release from the burden pressing down on them. She simply stood in the mud, helmet battered, braid whipping in stormlight, torn gloves clenched around her rifle strap. She carried the truth in her stance. Rescue was never final. The cost of survival was written across her uniform, across her bleeding gloves, across the civilians huddled at her feet. The helicopters were gone now, their rotors fading into the storm. The only sound was the storm itself and the steady, human rhythm of breath around her. Marines braced, civilians trembling, all held together by the fragile thread of endurance. Kayla inhaled once, sharp and steady. Her eyes shifted upriver, where floodwaters continued to climb, where more villages lay waiting, where more voices called out through static for salvation. The closing beat belonged not to victory, but to the refusal to stop. The drowned valley had been lost, swallowed whole, but Kayla carried forward the only thing that mattered, the fragile, imperfect survival of those she had dragged from its grip. Torn gloves bled into her rifle strap, braid whipping across her cheek, helmet battered in stormlight. She did not look back. Her duty lay ahead, in the darkness upriver, where survival still hung in the balance.